It's hard to explain how a day that starts with so much pride can end with your whole world on the verge of collapse. Elijah Jackson had woken up that morning feeling something he couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just excitement. It was that kind of nervous energy that only comes around on the biggest days of your life. He'd been selected for a highly competitive aviation experience program at Horizon Airlines, beating out hundreds of other students. He had studied, practiced, and poured his whole soul into every essay, interview, and simulator session to earn that badge. And that badge, now clipped carefully to the front of his hoodie, was more than plastic and print. It was a symbol, proof that he belonged somewhere he'd only dreamed about since he was a little kid watching planes through his bedroom window. As he stepped into the pilot's lounge at the airport, a place most people never even knew existed, Elijah didn't see himself as an outsider. He saw himself as someone finally stepping into the future he had built for himself. Miss Reynolds from HR had personally walked him there and told him to wait while she handled a quick errand. So, that's what he did. He sat quietly, watching a documentary about the history of commercial aviation, soaking it all in with wide eyes and a racing heart. For a few brief minutes he felt at peace, like maybe this really was the beginning of something big. He had no idea that in just a few moments, everything would start, unraveling in the worst way possible. The door to the lounge swung open hard, slamming against the wall like a warning shot, and Elijah snapped out of his aviation-filled daydream. Standing there was a tall white woman in a sharp pilot's uniform, the kind that makes people sit up straight without being told to. 4 golden stripes shimmered on her shoulders, clearly someone important. Captain Rebecca Whitman. She walked in fast, her face tight with suspicion, like she already knew something was, wrong before anyone said a word. Her eyes locked onto Elijah like a spotlight, and her tone came out sharp and biting, louder than necessary. Who let you in here? What are you doing in the pilot's lounge?" Elijah's heart started pounding in his chest. He stood up quickly, his palms already sweating. "Ma'am, I'm Elijah Jackson. I'm with the Horizon Career Exploration Program. Miss Reynolds told me I could wait here." But she didn't let him finish. Her mouth curled into something between a sneer and a smirk. "Career exploration? This isn't some play area. You don't belong in here. Get out. Now." Elijah froze, stunned by how fast her words cut him down. He raised his badge to show her, but she was already moving toward him, hand out. She grabbed the lanyard and yanked the ID off his neck, the strap snapping with a pop that felt way too loud. She flipped it over once and immediately declared, "Fake badge, I knew it. A kid like you doesn't belong in here. This is a serious security issue." Elijah could barely process the words. His stomach dropped. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was something much darker, something he had always feared but never truly imagined happening to him. And it was only just beginning. For a moment, Elijah couldn't move. It was like his feet had cemented to the floor. The badge, the one he had earned through weeks of work, interviews, and late-night essays, was now being treated like contraband. Captain Whitman turned away from him and pulled out her radio with a calmness that felt almost cruel. "Security, pilot's lounge. I have an unauthorized intruder in a restricted area, likely using a fake ID. Immediate assistance requested." Her voice was professional, clipped, and cold. Elijah's ears rang. He couldn't believe what was happening. He hadn't even stood up from the chair until she came in. He hadn't touched anything. He hadn't raised his voice, made a scene, or caused a single problem. All he had done was wait. Yet, suddenly people outside the lounge began peeking in, drawn by the sound of her voice and the tension in the air. They saw him standing there, and he could feel the shift in their eyes, curiosity melting into suspicion. Elijah's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Every explanation he wanted to give got stuck behind the lump in his throat. His body felt hot and cold at the same time. Fear crawled over his skin like static. He tried again. "Ma'am, I promise, I didn't fake anything. Miss Reynolds gave me that badge. She's coming right back." But Whitman didn't even look at him. She was already facing the gathering staff, her voice growing louder and more theatrical, like she was giving a lesson. "This is exactly why we must stay alert at all times." Young man using a forged ID, potentially trying to access sensitive pilot areas, could be gathering data or planning something worse. The words hit Elijah like punches to the chest. He wasn't just being accused. He was being made into an example, a threat, a warning. The whispers started spreading fast. the kind that come with half glances and turned backs. Elijah stood there, still trying to process how the dream morning he'd woken up to had become this slow-motion collapse. One minute he was watching a documentary about his favorite thing in the world, and the next he was being treated like a criminal. His hands shook as he took a step forward, trying to speak again, but the pressure of so many eyes made the words crumble before they left his lips. Then he saw them. 2 security officers walking toward him with brisk, measured steps. They looked serious, like they'd been trained to act without hesitation. Captain Whitman pointed at Elijah before they even arrived. "That's him," she said without pause, her tone full of certainty. "Search him. Remove him. We can't risk a breach of protocol because someone let their guard down." Elijah wanted to scream that this wasn't right, that someone just needed to call Miss Reynolds and clear everything up. But before he could say anything, one of the officers, a tall man with a stern jawline, said, "Young man, please come with us. We need to verify your identity and get to the bottom of this." Elijah stepped back automatically, his instincts telling him to create space but not to run. His voice cracked as he tried to stay calm. "Please, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm supposed to be here. Miss Reynolds can explain. She just stepped out. I swear I'm not lying." But the way the officers looked at him made it clear they didn't believe him either. Or maybe they were just following orders. Either way, Elijah felt his world shrinking, the walls closing in, the badge that had once meant everything now reduced to nothing but a twisted accusation hanging over his head. Elijah's voice trembled as he pulled out his phone, his last lifeline in a room full of people who had already decided who he was. "Please," he whispered, barely audible, "let me call my dad. He can explain everything. He knows about this program, I swear he does." Captain Whitman crossed her arms and let out a scoff, a cruel smile creeping onto her face as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Go ahead," she said loudly, with enough sarcasm to make every word sting. "Though I doubt your dad can do much to help in a situation like this. And don't worry, when this is over, I'll make sure your parents, probably working night shifts cleaning the airport floors, are dealt with too." Her words were like a slap in the face, and for a brief second, silence fell over the room. Not because anyone disagreed, no one even spoke up, but because of the weight of what had just been said. Elijah blinked rapidly, holding back the tears that threatened to spill over. He clenched his jaw, refusing to let himself cry in front of them. Not here. Not like this. His hands were shaking so much that he could barely type his father's number into his phone. Each ring echoed louder in his ears than the last, like countdown bells to some kind of public execution. Everyone watched him like he was a spectacle, like he was entertainment, a security threat, not a 16-year-old kid. Just hours ago, he had felt like he was finally walking into the future he always dreamed of. Now, he stood alone in a room full of strangers, his dignity stripped from him like the badge that had been ripped from his neck. While the phone continued to ring in his trembling hands, Elijah tried to remember why he had come here in the first place. He had earned his spot. He hadn't slipped in through a back door or lied to get through security. He'd been selected, chosen, because he had worked for it, because he deserved it. But none of that mattered now. All they saw was a black kid in the wrong place, a threat until proven otherwise. He closed his eyes and tried to slow his breathing, tried to block out the cold stares, the hushed comments, the growing tension. In the middle of all that chaos, his mind did something strange. It pulled up a memory, a warm, comforting moment from a time that felt like a lifetime ago. He was 6 years old, standing with his father at Dulles International Airport, staring up in awe at the massive body of a Boeing 777. It was his birthday, and his dad, David Jackson, who worked for the FAA, had arranged for a special behind-the-scenes tour. Elijah remembered looking up at the belly of that plane, feeling like he was in the presence of something magical. His dad had placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "One day, you'll fly one of these. I believe in you." That was the first moment Elijah had ever dared to dream of becoming a pilot. That belief had fueled every decision since. All the late nights studying aerodynamics, all the hours spent on flight simulators, all the times he faced doubt and pushed through. He had held on to that dream like a lifeline, through good days and hard ones. But now, in this quiet war zone disguised as a break room, he wondered if belief alone was enough to survive something like this. The phone finally clicked and his father's voice came through, strong and clear. "Elijah, what's going on?" Hearing that voice, so familiar, so full of calm authority, shook Elijah's defenses. Everything he'd been holding back came crashing forward in a wave of panic he couldn't contain. "Dad," he said, choking on the word. "They're saying I wasn't allowed here. They took my badge. They think I faked it. They're calling security. No one's listening to me." The line went silent for a second, just long enough for Elijah to feel the full weight of his fear settle on his chest. Then his father replied, calm but firm, "Stay where you are. I'm on my way. Don't say another word to anyone until I get there." Elijah's knees almost gave out. It wasn't just relief, it was the feeling of being seen, of knowing someone still believed him. Around him, though, nothing had changed. Captain Whitman looked amused by the entire exchange. "Oh, he called Daddy," she said mockingly, her voice dripping with scorn. "I hope he's not coming to mop the floors." Laughter rippled softly through the room from a few airport staff and pilots, the kind of laughter that doesn't come from humor but from cruelty. Elijah looked around, but no one stepped in to defend him. He stood there, silent, surrounded by people who had already decided what kind of person he was. And what hurt most wasn't just the accusations, it was the ease with which everyone accepted them, like they'd been waiting for a reason to believe the worst. And now, they had one. The two security officers didn't say much. One of them, after receiving a quiet message on his radio, looked slightly confused, even hesitant. He leaned in to whisper something to his partner. They exchanged glances, then looked toward Captain Whitman, who was clearly growing impatient. "What is it?" she snapped, stepping forward. "You're just going to let him stand there and make calls?" One of the officers straightened up and responded quietly but firmly. "We've just been informed a senior official from the FAA is on their way here. We're instructed not to move the boy until they arrive." For the first time since this all began, Whitman hesitated. Her confident stance faltered for just a second before she scoffed and said, "The FAA? Really? What kind of official wastes time on a kid?" Her words were sarcastic, but there was a new tension behind them, an uncertainty she was trying to mask. Elijah, meanwhile, didn't move. He could feel the change in the air, subtle but real. Something was shifting. His father was coming. Someone was finally listening. Still, the damage had already been done. The stares, the whispers, the way people had looked at him like he didn't belong. That wouldn't be erased by one visit. He glanced down at his phone again, watching the seconds tick by. Every minute that passed felt like a lifetime. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and humiliation, a small flame had reignited. Maybe he wasn't entirely alone in this fight. Maybe someone still believed in the truth, and that, for now, was just enough to keep him standing. The tension in the room felt like it could snap at any second. Everyone stood still, caught in a strange kind of limbo, waiting to see what would happen next. Elijah didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the door, silently counting every breath. Then, suddenly, the walkie-talkie on one of the security officers crackled to life. "Attention all units. A VIP group is entering the pilot's lounge area. Prepare for arrival." That single announcement shifted the energy like a bolt of electricity. Heads turned. People whispered. Captain Whitman's eyebrows pulled together in confusion. "What VIP?" she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Then footsteps, firm, deliberate, echoing across the tile floor, grew louder and closer. The door opened, and Elijah's heart nearly burst out of his chest. There, walking with purpose, was his father, David Jackson, not in a janitor's uniform, not a man coming from some maintenance closet, but in a sharp FAA administrator suit, flanked by a small team of high-ranking officials. Every conversation in the lounge died instantly. All eyes followed David as he moved toward his son, his expression unreadable, but his presence alone radiated authority. He stopped in front of Elijah, placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, and asked, "Are you okay?" Elijah nodded, his eyes stinging. Just hearing those words, spoken softly and without judgment, nearly broke him. His father turned, slowly, deliberately, to face Captain Whitman. His voice, calm but full of weight, rang out across the room. "I'm David Jackson, Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. I've been informed of the situation involving my son, Elijah Jackson, and I'd like to know what justification you had to accuse him of being a security threat. Captain Whitman froze. For a split second, the smug confidence that had defined her every move vanished from her face. She opened her mouth to speak but couldn't seem to form words. I didn't know he was your son," she stammered, her voice shaky, her posture suddenly smaller. "I was only trying to ensure security in the lounge. I thought his badge was fake." Mr. Jackson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words came slow, precise, and razor-sharp. "Airport security is important, but using authority to harass and humiliate a child based on nothing more than personal assumptions is unacceptable. You made a public accusation without evidence. You turned my son into a suspect in front of an entire room." There was no sound in the lounge now. Even the low hum of idle chatter had vanished. Whitman stood frozen, her eyes wide, her hands now nervously fidgeting in front of her. Mr. Jackson's voice remained calm but carried a kind of quiet force that demanded attention. "Let me ask you this again," he said, staring her down. "What made you so certain that a 16-year-old student who was enrolled in a verified FAA-approved program was a threat?" Whitman swallowed hard. "I didn't recognize the badge, and he was alone. I thought I was following protocol." Mr. Jackson narrowed his eyes. "You thought," he repeated, his tone pointed. "And in that thought you projected your own bias. You didn't ask questions. You didn't verify anything. You assumed. And now, here we are." Elijah, still standing beside his father, watched the shift happen in real time. For the first time that day, it wasn't him standing alone under the weight of suspicion. It was Whitman, and everyone was finally seeing her for what she was. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with judgment and unspoken realizations. Captain Whitman looked around the room, maybe hoping someone, anyone, would come to her defense. But no one moved. The other pilots, the staff who had laughed or watched silently before, were now staring at her with something closer to disappointment, even disgust. The security officers stood still, hands behind their backs, avoiding her gaze altogether. Mr. Jackson didn't let the moment drag. He turned to the officers and said, "You are here to enforce safety, not assumptions. I expect better. Treating a student like a criminal without verifying his credentials is a failure, not just of protocol, but of judgment." One of the officers nodded, visibly ashamed. He stepped forward, looked Elijah in the eye, and said quietly, "We're sorry, son. We didn't handle this the way we should have." Elijah nodded back slowly. It wasn't about apologies now. It was about being seen. And for the first time today, someone was seeing him as he truly was. Not a suspect, not a threat, but a student who had earned his place here. Captain Whitman, meanwhile, had gone completely quiet. Her shoulders were no longer straight. She seemed smaller now, as if all the power she had held over the room had drained out of her in the face of accountability. And that accountability wasn't just coming. It had already arrived. Mr. Jackson's presence had turned everything upside down. The woman who had tried to strip Elijah of his dignity was now standing on the edge of losing everything she had spent years building. And all because, in one moment, she chose to see a threat instead of a teenager with a dream. Then came the evidence. One of the FAA officials who had arrived with Mr. Jackson stepped forward, holding a tablet in his hand. "We've reviewed security footage from the lounge," he announced, his voice professional and loud enough for the room to hear. "What we found confirms Mr. Jackson's concerns." He connected the device to a screen mounted on the wall, and within seconds, video began to play. The footage showed Elijah entering the pilot's lounge with Miss Reynolds from HR. She was clearly visible, speaking to him, handing him a badge, and pointing to a seat. Everything was clear, calm, procedural. No sign of deceit, no breach, no threat. The video continued. Elijah sitting quietly, watching the aviation documentary, never moving from his seat. Then, the door flying open. Captain Whitman storming in. Her confrontation with Elijah. The way she yanked the badge from his neck. The way she ignored his explanations. It was all there. Everything. The room watched in silence as the video played. When it ended, no one said a word, because there was nothing left to say. The facts had stripped away any room for interpretation. Elijah had done exactly what he said he had, and Captain Whitman had acted on nothing but her own bias. The FAA official cleared his throat. Additionally, He continued, "Upon review of Captain Whitman's record, we've found 3 formal complaints over the past 3 years, each alleging racially biased behavior toward both passengers and staff." A few audible gasps rose from the crowd. Whitman's face turned ghostly pale. It wasn't just about this one moment anymore. This was a pattern, and this time, there was no hiding it. Elijah stood still, barely breathing, his eyes locked on the screen that had just cleared his name. This was the moment he had hoped for, and the one he had feared might never come. Captain Whitman didn't try to defend herself anymore. Her mouth opened once or twice, like she wanted to say something, maybe offer some excuse, maybe beg for understanding. But nothing came out. She just stood there, the color drained from her face, her body stiff and shaking. The same woman who had stormed into the lounge with the confidence of a person in charge now looked like someone completely lost, caught in the spotlight of truth with nowhere to run. Mr. Jackson turned to her one final time, his voice no longer cold, but steady and resolute. "Captain Whitman," he said, "this is not just about my son. This is about every person you've ever humiliated, every opportunity you've denied, every time your position gave you the power to reinforce your personal prejudice and you used it without thought." The room remained dead silent, everyone feeling the weight of those words. Elijah, standing just behind his father, watched her shrink with each sentence, and as he looked around at the faces that had once stared at him with suspicion, now looking at her with contempt, he realized something important. This moment wasn't just about vindication. It was about justice, about finally seeing accountability reach someone who had gotten away with too much for too long. Mr. Jackson turned toward the FAA team. "I request that she be suspended immediately," he said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "Until a full investigation is completed, she should not be permitted to serve in any capacity that gives her authority over others." One of the FAA officials nodded firmly, and just like that, everything shifted. The power Whitman once held vanished in an instant, and Elijah, the boy who had walked in simply to wait for his mentor, was no longer the one under scrutiny. The security officers approached Captain Whitman slowly, this time not at Elijah's side, but hers. "Captain," one of them said quietly, "we need you to come with us." She didn't resist. She didn't argue. She simply lowered her head and walked between them, her shoulders slumped, her footsteps heavy. Every pair of eyes in the room followed her. Pilots, staff, FAA officials, all of them watching a woman who had once embodied authority and control, now exiting the same way she had come in, only this time stripped of her influence. No one offered her a comforting word. No one looked at her with sympathy. The silence that followed her exit was thick, not with tension anymore, but with the unmistakable stillness of consequence. Elijah remained still. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. What he felt wasn't victory. It was something deeper, a mix of sadness and relief, of knowing justice had been served, but also realizing how close he'd come to losing everything because of someone else's bias. Mr. Jackson gently placed a hand on his son's back. "It's over," he said softly. Elijah nodded, but part of him knew this day would never really be over. The memory of it, the feeling of standing alone and being judged before being heard, that would stay with him. But so would this, the image of his father standing up for him, of truth clearing his name, and of the look on every face in that room as they realized they'd been wrong. That mattered more than anything. For the first time since Captain Whitman had stormed in, Elijah exhaled, not just a breath, but a release, of fear, of shame, of everything he'd been forced to carry alone. And now, with the truth out in the open, he didn't feel small anymore. He felt like he belonged. As the room slowly began to regain a sense of normalcy, Mr. Jackson turned his attention to the gathered FAA officials and airline staff. His tone shifted from personal to professional, but it kept the same weight that had silenced everyone earlier. "We must ensure this never happens again," he said firmly. "Today, it was my son, but tomorrow, it could be someone without a voice, someone without the means to prove they belong. We need to review our training, our hiring practices, and the way we empower people in leadership roles." Heads nodded, not out of obligation, but because they knew he was right. What had unfolded wasn't an isolated incident. It was a mirror reflecting something bigger, an ugly you, truth that had lived too long in silence. One of the FAA officials stepped forward and began taking notes, already drafting an outline of the investigation process. Another contacted Horizon Airlines leadership to coordinate transparency. Meanwhile, Elijah stood beside his father, quiet but deeply present. He watched as people who once saw him as a problem now looked at him differently, not just with regret, but with a kind of quiet admiration. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't fought back with anger. He had stood his ground, even when it felt like the ground was falling apart beneath him. Mr. Jackson turned to Elijah and met his eyes. "I'm proud of you," he said, not for the first time, but this time it carried a deeper meaning. Elijah nodded, a small smile creeping onto his face. He didn't need a crowd's approval or even an apology from everyone who had doubted him. He had stood up for himself with integrity, and he had been seen. Just when Elijah thought the day couldn't surprise him anymore, a voice spoke up from across the room, a voice he didn't recognize but that carried warmth and authority. "Elijah, right?" He turned to see a woman in a pilot's uniform walking toward him. She was black, maybe in her 40s, with a confident posture and a kind expression. Her badge read, "Captain Amara Johnson." She extended a hand, and Elijah shook it slowly, still unsure of what to expect. "I've been with this airline for over 20 years, she said, "and I've seen a lot of things. But what happened today, that wasn't just unfair, it was wrong, and I'm sorry you had to experience it." Elijah didn't know what to say. Captain Johnson continued, "I'd like to invite you to come with me. I'm flying out in about an hour. Come to the cockpit with me before the flight. I want you to see where you belong." Her words hit him like a second wave, but this time it wasn't panic or fear. It was something else. Gratitude, recognition, a door opening. He looked up at his father, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Captain Johnson smiled. "You've earned your place, Elijah. Don't let anyone make you question that again." Elijah's chest rose with a deep breath, steadier than any he'd taken all day. He followed her out of the lounge, past the same people who had watched his humiliation, without saying a word. Only this time, they moved aside for him. Some nodded in quiet respect. A few even offered hushed apologies. And as Elijah walked behind Captain Johnson, the fear that had once gripped him began to fade. Step by step, dignity returned to him. Not given, but reclaimed. The walk to the cockpit felt surreal. Every step Elijah took down the long corridor of the terminal felt like it was carrying him further away from the trauma of the break room and closer to the dream he had nearly lost. Captain Johnson chatted casually as they walked, telling him about the 787 she was about to fly, and how she still got butterflies every time she sat in the pilot's seat, even after 2 decades. "That never really goes away," she said with a chuckle. "And honestly, I wouldn't want it to." Elijah listened closely, soaking in every word. He didn't speak much. He was still processing everything, but his silence wasn't from fear anymore. It was from awe, gratitude, reflection. The hallway was quieter than the chaos he'd left behind, and the change in atmosphere was like being able to breathe fresh air after hours trapped in a smoke-filled room. As they neared the jet bridge, Elijah noticed the difference in how people looked at him. No longer the suspicious glances, the doubt. Now there was recognition. There was respect. It wasn't loud or flashy, just a few people nodding. A quiet, "Hey, I'm sorry," from a ground crew member, a thumbs up from someone across the gate. And maybe that was enough. Maybe it didn't erase what happened, but it showed that people were learning. Captain Johnson stopped before the cockpit door and turned to him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "This," she said, gesturing toward the flight deck, "is where you belong, and you're going to get here. I can see it." Elijah looked past her into the space he'd dreamed of since he was 6 years old. The glowing panels, the organized chaos of buttons and switches, the view of the open sky just beyond the glass. And for the first time all day, he let himself believe again, truly believe, that this future was still his. Stepping into the cockpit felt like stepping into a sacred space. Elijah's eyes darted across every control, every screen, every panel. He could feel his heart beating in his chest, not from fear anymore, but from joy. Pure, honest joy. Captain Johnson explained a few of the instruments, showed him how the systems were aligned, and even let him sit in the first officer's seat. Elijah's hands hovered over the controls, not touching anything, just taking it all in. "When I first sat here," she told him softly, "I was just a trainee. The captain beside me didn't look like me. Nobody really believed I'd make it past the first year. But I stayed. I fought. And eventually, I flew." Her voice was calm, but filled with a kind of strength Elijah could feel in his bones. She didn't have to explain what it had taken for her to get here. He already knew, because he'd seen the same resistance in the faces that had doubted him just hours ago. He turned toward her, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you for showing me this, for believing I belong here." She smiled, and it wasn't forced or polite. It was real. "You didn't need me to believe in you, Elijah. You already believed in yourself. That's what matters most." Elijah looked out the cockpit window at the runway stretching into the horizon. It didn't just represent a flight path anymore. It was a symbol of something bigger, of moving forward, of taking off despite the turbulence. He knew now that the pain he had endured today would never fully disappear, but neither would the lesson it taught him. This wasn't just about one confrontation in a break room. It was about fighting for space where people said you didn't belong, and proving that you always did. When Elijah and Captain Johnson finally stepped out of the cockpit, something inside him had shifted. It wasn't just that he'd sat in the place he dreamed about for years. It was that someone who looked like him, someone who had faced many of the same battles, had welcomed him into that space without hesitation. That moment had repaired something the morning had nearly broken. As they walked back down the jet bridge, a few airline employees stood nearby, quietly watching them. One of them, a flight attendant with silver hair and a soft expression, stepped forward. "I just wanted to say," she said gently, "you handled yourself with more grace than most adults I know. I'm sorry for what you went through. You didn't deserve that." Elijah managed a small smile, his throat tightening again, but this time, not from fear. It was a different kind of emotion now, one rooted in being seen, being understood. Back in the terminal, his father was waiting with the same calm strength that had carried Elijah through this storm. Mr. Jackson placed a hand on his son's shoulder, not needing to say much. The look they shared was enough, the kind of look that said, "You did good. You stood your ground." Captain Johnson gave Elijah one last nod before heading off toward her gate. "Keep going," she said. "Don't stop for anyone." And with that, she disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a spark Elijah hadn't felt in hours, a spark of hope. As they walked together toward the airport exit, Elijah took one last look back at the pilot's lounge. It looked exactly the same. Nothing had changed in the walls or the furniture, but everything had changed inside of him. The room that had once tried to crush him had, in the end, made him stronger. In the weeks that followed, Elijah's story began to spread. It wasn't because he tried to make it viral. He didn't post anything or ask for attention. But the video footage, the statements from the FAA, and the raw truth of what happened sparked something across the aviation community. Word got around that the son of the FAA administrator had been falsely accused and humiliated, and that his father had shown up, not with anger, but with justice. For some, it was just another news item. But for others, especially young people of color dreaming of breaking into spaces that often felt closed off, it was something else entirely. It was a signal, a turning point. The FAA launched new diversity and anti-bias training across multiple airports. Horizon Airlines, under public pressure and internal reflection, partnered with several organizations to create mentorship programs for underrepresented youth in aviation. And Elijah, he didn't fade into the background. He became a quiet but powerful figure, a speaker at schools, a guest at workshops, a face for possibility. At every event, he told his story not with bitterness, but with clarity. He talked about the fear, the isolation, the shame, but he also talked about the strength it took to stand there and not crumble, the dignity his father had shown, the kindness of Captain Johnson, the long path still ahead. And every time he ended his story with one simple truth: no one should have to prove they belong because of the color of their skin. But if they do, I hope they never forget they're not alone. And in those rooms full of kids who had once doubted whether their dreams were too big, Elijah's presence said everything they needed to hear. You belong here, just like I do. Elijah didn't think of himself as a hero. He didn't walk around like someone who had survived a battle, even though in a way he had. He was just a teenager who wanted to fly. That was all. But something about what he had been through changed how he moved through the world. There was a new sense of awareness in him, a deeper understanding of how quickly perception could turn into punishment. And while he still believed in the dream, he now knew that getting there would take more than just effort. It would take resilience. Still, that experience didn't make him bitter. It made him more determined. Every time he fired up his flight simulator, he pushed himself harder, stayed up later, asked tougher questions. And every time he looked at the model planes lining the shelf in his bedroom, they didn't feel like toys anymore. They felt like promises, reminders that the sky wasn't just something to look at, but something to reach for. His father continued to support him in every way possible, giving advice, connecting him to mentors, reminding him that what happened didn't define him, but how he responded to it would. And Elijah responded by rising, quietly, steadily, with more fire than before. Even in school, his classmates started seeing him differently, not because of his connection to the FAA, but because of how he handled everything, with calm, with focus, with a level of strength most people twice his age couldn't maintain under pressure. He wasn't trying to inspire anyone. He was just living his truth, and that, in itself, had become enough to inspire others. Eventually, media outlets picked up his story. Some focused on the scandal, the controversy. Others focused on the resolution, the suspension of Captain Whitman, the policy changes, the statements from the FAA. But the most meaningful stories were the ones told by people who saw themselves in Elijah. Emails and messages began pouring in from teenagers across the country. Black kids who wanted to fly, girls who dreamed of being engineers, immigrant students who felt invisible in their schools. They wrote to Elijah not just to say thank you, but to say, me too. His story became something larger than him. It became a mirror for all the kids who had ever been told, directly or indirectly, that their dreams didn't fit where they came from. Elijah, read every message. Some made him cry, some made him angry, but all of them reminded him why this story, his story, had to be told with honesty. Because the truth was, it could have gone another way. If his father hadn't picked up that phone, if the security guards had acted just a little faster, if the evidence hadn't been recorded. Elijah knew how close he'd come to losing not just a day, but a future. And that made him more committed than ever to speaking out, not as a victim, but as a witness. A reminder, a living example that courage and dignity can survive even the most unfair circumstances, and that sometimes the smallest decision, to stay calm, to speak truth, to make a call, can change everything. For Captain Whitman, the fallout was swift and unforgiving. After the FAA completed their investigation, she was officially removed from her position, and her pilot's license was suspended indefinitely pending a review of all past misconduct. Her name, once spoken with respect in aviation, circles, now carried a stain that couldn't be ignored. The story had reached far beyond the airport. News segments dissected it. Op-eds questioned how someone with a history of complaints had managed to stay in power for so long. And while Whitman didn't offer any public statement beyond a carefully worded apology through her attorney, those who had once defended her began to distance themselves. It wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about the system that had allowed someone like her to thrive unchecked. In private forums and closed meetings, airline leaders were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. And that discomfort was exactly what needed to happen. Because change doesn't come from comfort. It comes from moments like this, ugly, raw, undeniable. For many, Whitman's downfall was a cautionary tale. For others, it was justice long overdue. But for Elijah, it was never about revenge. He didn't celebrate her punishment. He didn't carry her name like a trophy. What mattered most was that it was over, that the lie told about him had been dismantled in full public view, that people had seen the truth not because he yelled the loudest, but because he stood his ground with grace. That meant more to him than any headline. And in the quiet moments, when he was alone, he didn't think about her. He thought about flying, about the sky, about where he was going next. With the support of his father and the recognition he had received, Elijah was invited to speak at an FAA Youth Summit later that year. He stood on stage in front of hundreds of students, educators, and aviation professionals. And for the first time, he wasn't nervous. He began by telling them the truth, not the edited, polished version, but the real story. The fear, the shame, the way people had looked at him, the helplessness of standing in a room where no one believed you. And then, the turning point, his father's voice on the phone, the security footage, the power of being seen, not just as a problem, but as a person. He told them about the cockpit, about Captain Johnson, and about how, despite everything, he still loved to fly. "I'm not here because I want sympathy," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I'm here because I don't want what happened to me to happen to any of you. Ever." The room was silent, not out of discomfort, but because everyone was listening, really listening. And when he finished, the applause wasn't just loud, it was real, the kind that comes from people who have felt something shift inside them. After the summit, several students came up to him, some nervous, some excited. They asked questions about the career program, about flying, about how he stayed calm when everything felt like it was falling apart. Elijah answered them with the same honesty that had carried him through his own storm. And for every young face that lit up when he spoke, he saw a little piece of himself, a reminder that this journey wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs too. At home, things slowly returned to normal, but Elijah was different now. Not in a bad way, just more grounded, more aware. He still geeked out over airplane specs, still spent hours on flight simulators, still kept his model planes neatly arranged on the shelves above his desk. But now, when he looked at them, he saw more than just machines. He saw what they represented: opportunity, freedom, and the right to chase a dream, no matter who tried to block the runway. His father noticed the change too. Their talks shifted from casual mentoring to deeper conversations about race, power, and how to navigate a world that sometimes didn't want to see you succeed. Mr. Jackson didn't sugarcoat anything. He spoke with clarity, but always made sure Elijah knew he wasn't alone. "There will be more days like that one," he once told him. "Maybe not the same, but days when you'll feel like you're fighting just to be seen. And when they come, I want you to remember this. You made it through, with your head up." Elijah carried those words like armor, not to be bitter, not to be angry, but to be ready, and more than that, to lift others up when they faced the same struggle. He started mentoring a few younger students in his school who were applying to the same career program he had, helping them with essays, walking them through the interview process, giving them tips on how to talk about their passion without sounding rehearsed. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he knew what it felt like to be on the edge of something big, and how terrifying it was to think that one person's doubt could take it all away. He never wanted anyone to feel that alone again. Sometimes Elijah would get emails from strangers, parents, teachers, even flight instructors, thanking him for speaking up, for being a role model, for showing what resilience looked like. It always caught him off guard. He didn't see himself as someone remarkable. He was still a teenager figuring things out, still had bad days, still made mistakes. But those messages reminded him that impact doesn't require perfection. It just requires honesty. He started keeping a folder on his computer called Fuel. It was filled with screenshots of kind messages, photos from his school visits, news articles about policy changes in aviation, and quotes from his father. When doubt crept in, which it still did sometimes, he'd open that folder and remind himself of what he'd survived, what he'd sparked, and who he was becoming. One evening, while sorting through those files, he stumbled upon a blurry photo someone had taken of him and Captain Johnson the day she showed him the cockpit. They were both smiling, standing in front of the controls, and there was something about the image, something quietly powerful. He stared at it for a long time. That photo captured more than just a moment. It captured a turning point, a shift, the very beginning of the life he was now walking into. A life shaped not by what was done to him, but by how he responded. A life built on courage, not revenge, on justice, not bitterness, and above all, on purpose. Elijah printed the photo and pinned it above his desk, right next to the model of the Boeing 787. The dream hadn't changed, but now it had a deeper meaning, and it wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to every kid who needed to be reminded that they deserved to fly too. The following spring, Elijah received a special invitation from Horizon Airlines. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a formal acknowledgement. They wanted him to return as a guest of honor at the next Career Exploration Program kickoff event, the same program where everything had started. At first, he wasn't sure he wanted to go back. The memory of that day, of sitting in the lounge and being torn apart by suspicion, still lingered somewhere in his chest. But his father encouraged him. "Sometimes the best way to take your power back," Mr. Jackson said, "is to stand tall exactly where they tried to tear you down." So Elijah said yes. And when the day came, he walked through those same airport doors, not as a quiet, nervous participant, but as a speaker, a guest, a young man whose name had become a quiet but powerful force in a changing industry. This time, people greeted him with respect. The staff smiled, the security guards nodded, and a few even stopped him to shake his hand. Some of the same employees who had stood by in silence that day now looked at him with apology in their eyes. Elijah didn't hold grudges. He wasn't here to make anyone feel small. He was here to be big, to fill the space he had once been denied. When he stepped onto the stage in front of the newest group of students, he looked out at rows of hopeful faces, kids from different backgrounds, different cities, but all with one thing in common. They were dreamers, just like he had been. And this time, he told his story not as someone who had been wronged, but as someone who had grown stronger because of it. He spoke with conviction, and this time, no one dared to question whether he belonged. At the end of his talk, a girl from the front row raised her hand. She looked about 14, maybe 15, with wide eyes and an eager smile. "How did you stay so calm when people didn't believe you?" she asked. The room got quiet again. Elijah took a breath. He looked at the girl, then at the rest of the students. "Honestly," he said, "I didn't always feel calm. Inside, I was scared, angry, confused. But I kept thinking about my dream, and about the people who believed in me. My dad, my mentors. I knew if I let that moment define me, I'd lose everything I worked for. So I focused on staying true to who I was. That's what got me through." The girl nodded slowly, and others did too. It wasn't a flashy answer. It was real. After the event ended, a few students came up to thank him, and Elijah stayed behind, taking pictures, offering advice, listening to their stories. He didn't see himself as above them. He saw himself in them, and maybe that was what made his presence so impactful. He wasn't there to impress them. He was there to remind them they had power, even when the world tried to tell them otherwise. Before leaving the terminal that day, Elijah stood for a moment in front of the pilot's lounge, the place where it had all unraveled and where it had all begun. The door was closed just like before, but it no longer held power over him. It was just a door, and he knew now that no door could block his path unless he let it. With that final glance, he turned and walked away, not because he was running from it, but because he had already risen above it. Back at home that evening, Elijah sat with his father on the back porch, the quiet hum of the city in the distance. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange light across the yard, and for a while, they didn't say anything. They didn't have to. These were the kinds of moments Elijah had come to appreciate more than ever. The silence that didn't need filling, the presence that didn't need explaining. After a while, Mr. Jackson broke the silence with a question that caught Elijah off guard. "Do you ever wish that day had gone differently?" Elijah thought about it for a second. Then he shook his head. I wish it hadn't happened like that," he said. "But I don't think I'd change it, because if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have learned how strong I could be. I wouldn't have met Captain Johnson. I wouldn't have seen what justice looks like when it shows up in the room. And maybe all those kids who wrote to me, maybe they'd still be thinking they didn't have a place here." His dad nodded slowly, a proud smile on his face. "Sometimes the hardest days give us the clearest purpose," he said. Elijah let that sink in. He knew the scars from that experience would always be there, but they weren't wounds anymore. They were reminders of the moment he stood up, the moment he didn't back down, and the moment he proved, not just to others, but to himself, that he had everything it took to fly, not just through the air, but through life's hardest turbulence. That night, Elijah went to bed with the same dream he'd had since he was a little boy. Only now, it didn't feel distant. It felt like something already in motion, gaining altitude with every passing day. In the years that followed, Elijah's path unfolded just as he had hoped, and in ways he hadn't even imagined. He earned a scholarship to a top aviation university, graduated with honors, and eventually earned his pilot's license. The first time he flew solo, he cried when the wheels lifted off the ground, not from fear but from joy, from the realization that this moment had always lived inside him, waiting to become real. His father watched from the ground, hand over his heart, pride etched into every line of his face. Captain Johnson stayed in touch, always offering guidance and checking in on his progress. "Told you the sky was yours," she'd text him after each major milestone. Elijah began mentoring more young students, creating his own small initiative for underrepresented youth in aviation. He gave talks, hosted workshops, and invited kids to tour airports, cockpits, and control towers. The dream had grown beyond him. It had become a bridge, a movement. He never forgot the pain of being wrongly accused, of being looked at like a threat for simply existing in the wrong room. But he didn't live in that pain. He rose above it. He carried it not as a weight, but as a compass, always pointing him toward purpose. His story wasn't just a lesson in injustice, it was a blueprint for how to rise with grace, how to answer hate with truth, and how to stand in a place where you were once unwanted and declare, without shame or apology, "I belong here." Years later, when asked what kept him going during that dark day at the airport, Elijah always gave the same answer: my father's voice, and my own belief that I was more than what they saw. And in the end, that belief had lifted him higher than any plane ever could. One summer afternoon, long after the storm had passed and the headlines had faded, Elijah found himself invited back to the very airport where everything had begun, not for a confrontation, not for an apology, but for a celebration. Horizon Airlines was unveiling a new scholarship program for underrepresented youth in aviation, and they wanted Elijah to help launch it. They named it The Sky Is Yours Initiative, and its mission was clear: to ensure that no aspiring pilot would ever be denied opportunity because of race, background, or bias. As Elijah walked through the terminal, now wearing the uniform of a licensed pilot, employees and passengers greeted him warmly. Some recognized him, others just smiled, sensing his presence carried weight. When he stepped up to the podium to speak, he paused for a moment and looked around the room. So many new faces, full of potential, so many young people staring up at him the way he once looked up at others. "I was once in this very building, scared and unsure if I'd ever get to live this dream," he began. "But I had people who stood up for me. I had truth on my side. And most importantly, I held on to the belief that I belonged in this space, even when others tried to convince me I didn't." The audience was silent, hanging on to his every word. "You will face resistance," he continued. "You will be underestimated. But that doesn't define you. Your integrity, your work, your perseverance. That's what defines you. And if you remember that, no one can take your future from you." The room erupted into applause, not because Elijah sought praise, but because his story had become a shared beacon of strength for everyone who had ever dared to dream past the limits others tried to place on them. After the event, Elijah wandered through the terminal alone for a while, taking it all in. He stopped in front of the pilot's lounge, staring at the door that had once been a barrier, a place where his identity had been questioned and his integrity doubted. But today, he didn't feel anger. He didn't even feel sadness. What he felt was clarity. That door had been a test, a line drawn in the sand, and he had crossed it, not with force, but with dignity. He thought of all the people who had shown up for him when it mattered most: his father, Captain Johnson, the quiet staff members who later apologized, the students who reached out. And he thought of those who hadn't, those who watched in silence or believed the worst. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need their approval. He had everything he needed now. As he stood there, a young boy walked past holding his mother's hand, his eyes glued to Elijah's uniform. Elijah smiled at him, and the boy smiled back, wide-eyed and curious. That look, that spark of wonder, reminded Elijah of himself at that age, staring up at planes from his bedroom window. He gave the boy a small wave, and the child waved back, tugging on his mother's arm. "Mom, I want to be like him," the boy whispered. Elijah's heart swelled, not from pride, but from purpose. That small interaction was everything. Proof that his journey hadn't just led him to where he belonged, but was now lighting the way for others to find where they belonged too. He turned from the lounge door and kept walking, his steps steady, his shoulders relaxed. The past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled him. He had taken off, and there was no ceiling to what came next. Months later, Elijah received a handwritten letter in the mail. It was unusual. Most messages came through email or social media, but this envelope was different. The handwriting was neat, but hesitant, the kind that carried weight behind every stroke. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and no return address. He opened it carefully and began to read. It was from a former Horizon Airlines employee, a quiet observer who had been present the day of the confrontation in the lounge. The letter started with an apology, an honest one. The writer admitted they had been there, had watched what happened, and had done nothing. "I wasn't brave," the note read. "I saw what she did to you. I knew it wasn't right, but I stayed quiet. I told myself it wasn't my place, that someone else would speak up, but no one did, and for that, I am truly sorry." Elijah sat with the letter in his lap for a long time. The words weren't easy to read, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. The letter continued, "Watching how you handled that day, the way you stood your ground, it's haunted me in the best way. It woke me up. Since then, I've committed to speaking up, to mentoring others, and to never standing silent again." Elijah folded the letter carefully and placed it in the fuel folder on his desk. It didn't erase what had happened, but it mattered. It reminded him that change often starts with one voice, but it echoes, sometimes quietly, sometimes slowly, in ways you don't expect. And sometimes, the people who let you down in one chapter become the reason someone else is protected in the next. Forgiveness didn't require forgetting. It just required growth. And this letter was proof that growth was happening. That winter, Elijah returned to the same airport once more, but this time, he was flying out as a co-pilot. His first official commercial flight. He arrived early, uniform crisp, heart pounding with the same nervous excitement he'd felt as a teenager. But now it wasn't uncertainty, it was anticipation. As he stepped onto the tarmac and climbed into the plane, the weight of that moment settled around him like a second skin. This wasn't just a job, it was a reclamation, a full-circle moment. His captain for the flight was none other than Amara Johnson. When she saw him enter the cockpit, she stood and grinned wide. "Told you we'd fly together one day," she said. They went through pre-flight checks with the calm rhythm of seasoned professionals, but underneath it all, there was something else. Mutual respect, mutual victory. The flight was smooth, uneventful. Passengers chatted quietly, unaware of the personal triumph unfolding just behind the cockpit door. And as Elijah guided the plane through landing, his hands steady on the controls, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. After the passengers disembarked, he stepped out into the terminal, where a group of student trainees had gathered to meet the flight crew. One of them, a young black girl with bright eyes and a notebook in hand, stepped forward shyly. "Are you Elijah Jackson?" she asked. He nodded, smiling. "I've read about you," she said. "I want to be a pilot too." He knelt down slightly so they were eye to eye. "Then you will be," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She smiled wide, and Elijah stood, shoulders back, gaze forward. The sky hadn't just opened for him, it had widened for others too, and he was ready to lead them into it. Years from now, when Elijah would look back on his journey, he wouldn't remember every detail of the chaos that tried to break him. What he would remember was standing in a room where no one believed in him, and choosing to believe in himself anyway. He would remember the sting of humiliation, yes, but more than that, the quiet power of dignity, of refusing to shrink, of standing tall even when his voice shook. He would remember the way his father's hand steadied him, the strength in Captain Johnson's words, and the look in that young trainee's eyes when she said, "I want to be a pilot too," because that's what legacy really is. Not medals or applause, but moments that pass strength from one soul to another. Elijah never set out to be a symbol. He just wanted to fly. But in holding on to that dream through storms of doubt and discrimination, he became more than he'd ever imagined. Not just a pilot, but a pathfinder. a bridge between the sky and those who had been told they didn't belong in it. And in doing so, he didn't just claim his place. He created space for voices, for dreams, for justice. The sky, once a distant dream, was now his home. And as his plane soared through the clouds, as the engines hummed beneath his hands, Elijah looked out over the horizon, a quiet smile on his face. Not because he had escaped the weight of the past, but because he had transformed it. And that transformation, written not just in headlines but in hearts, would live far beyond him. The boy they tried to silence had become the man who flew, and no one, no uniform, no gate, no nameplate, would ever take that from him again.